Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us. This is the TSSI Refuting Marxist Inconsistency, perhaps show. Oh dear, I've got my own audio on. 1 second. Okay, so who do we have here on the show here today with us? We have got Lexi.
Hey, what's up? Lexi from Swampside, Emancipation. How you doing?
We've got Amog.
Hi, it's Amog from Symptomatic Redness.
And we got Emmanuel and Aidan.
Hi, this is Emmanuel from the podcast En Förlorad Sak in Swedish, or A Lost Cause. And
Aidan, I'm a student kind of Emmanuel's. Yeah, reading them from the beginning.
that sounds like we're a sect.
Yeah.
I'm a bit worried about it. Yeah.
I don't believe it.
Good. No one should.
A very small sect. A very small sect. And I think we also have Alex. Alex, can you hear me? Or us?
I think I can. I think I can, Tom. Hello, can you hear me?
We can indeed. Alex is a listener of my show, and he expressed an interest in joining as well. Okay, so can we all default to our mute buttons just in general? So what can people see? People can see. Okay, so we're starting off here. We're going to be reading Andrew Kleiman's Reclaiming Marx's Capital, a refutation of the myth of inconsistency, and we're going to be going chapter and verse all the way through, hopefully, over a number of shows like this, to try and tease out the arguments about whether Marx's economics is inconsistent or not, and if the TSSI, which is short for the temporal single system interpretation, is it close to what Marx said? Is it what Marx meant? And B, does it actually make sense? So that's what we're trying to get through and trying to figure out, and also talk about where we can the other schools and what they say about things, and try and come up with what 4 or 5 of us extremely intelligent people think about it. Does anybody else have anything to say before we start?
Not really, other than I've been chipping away at this debate for about 5 or 6 years. And 6 years ago is probably when I read Reclaiming Marx's Capital, which was one of the books that made me think, hey, being a Marxist doesn't seem totally crazy. So glad to be doing this.
Yeah, so I'm similar. I read it a few years ago. I agreed with the book, not that I was an expert in any of this stuff, and I reread it in preparation for this show, and I must say it convinced me a second time, probably even more so. But I haven't read that much, next to none of the alternatives, so perhaps I'm just naive and falling for it. So who wants to tell us about the story about the lion, the statue? Lexi.
I will start. So let's get to the lion and the statue. This is a nice mythical preface here, or is this in the first? This is in the first chapter. It's not in the preface. Okay. The lion and the statue. I'll just read the first paragraph. One of Aesop's fables, The Lion and the Statue, is the story of an argument between a man and a lion over which species is stronger. Eventually, the man takes the lion to the public gardens and points to a statue of Hercules strangling a lion. This proves, the man exclaims, that humans are the stronger species. No, the lion replies. It proves nothing, since a man made the statue. If lions could make statues, Hercules would be lying under the lion's paw. And so this is a metaphor for what he'll later term the Whiggish sort of interpretation of economic theory, where as time has gone on, we've weeded out all the bad ideas. And now we just have, this good, pure science. And the thing that Kleiman is most interested in is how this narrative is repeated within Marxism itself, that Marxist economists seem to believe that Marx's theory was part of the errors of history that need to be avoided. And yet they somehow still represent themselves as Marxists. And that's like the academic quandary Kleiman is pointing to here.
Yeah. So this is like we see it, you know, I've said this before in different podcasts. I say it all the time because I'm quite a dullard, but like, you know, there is a, you know, if you want to get a job as a Marxist professor, you kind of have to come up with a new theory and show why Marx was wrong in the first place. And I think a lot of the stuff that Kleiman is fighting against is some of that, and also some attacks that have been leveled by bourgeois economists over the years, and all the impacts that they've had on essentially, you know, people taking Marxist economics seriously. Emmanuel, do you want to go on about the next bit, maybe about what this book isn't and is about? You were talking about it beforehand.
Yeah, so this was actually just like you, Tom, this is my second time around. This book, for me, just as it was for Lexi, was kind of the first entree into thinking that, hey, Marxists don't need to be these academic wizards or whatever with impenetrable jargon, but it can actually make sense. And since then, I've come to believe that, you know, Marx was actually consistent and Marxist economics actually works. But what I find fascinating about Kleiman's sort of mission here in this book is that he explicitly states that, you know, I'm not going to try to prove that Marxist economics is good or is valid or is true. In fact, he states also that he's going to try to disprove some evidence, supposed evidence for Marxist theory, because just to convince sort of the reader that he's not out to make everyone a Marxist. What he is about is to try to make to refute the claim that Marx's own theory, so not Marxism in general, not some sort of strange Marxist school, but Marx's own theory. The claim that Marx's own theory, the one that he wrote in Capital Volume 1 and 2 and 3, the claim that that is inconsistent is what he's out to dispel and disprove. And he hopes that by convincing people that Marx's own theory on its own merits is consistent and logically valid, if that can be shown, then we can have a discussion about whether or not it's actually applicable to reality. But his claim is sort of, we need to start with having a theory that makes sense.
Yeah, and I skipped over the most important part of 1.1, the line in the statue, and to build off of that point, that the main thesis of the book is that these, you know, these human building statues, these Marxists building their own narrative, have so-called proved that Marx is internally inconsistent, logically inconsistent, mathematically inconsistent. That is, doesn't even look good on paper, isn't even wrong, not even a theory, right? That's what he's seeking to. That's the myth he's seeking to overturn, and the specific points that he gets into are these concepts of simultaneous and dual systems versus temporal single systems. Should we spend a moment talking about what that means, just so that when it comes up later, it will...
Yeah, okay, well, so the general idea is that some people think, well, Marx's value theory, well, maybe what we'll do is we'll go through what Marx means by his value theory before we get into that first.
Okay,
you know,
fair.
Yeah, first part of chapter 2. So, well, example, you want to talk about like what internal inconsistency means. I know when I read it first, like, you know, I have a degree in pure mathematics, and when I was reading it, I was kind of questioning how would I put it? I was questioning the kind of importance of consistency in my own head. thinking like, well, if the results look like reality, do we really care if on the edges there's some minor inconsistency? Do people want to talk about why they think it's so important?
Yeah, so I think one way to think about it, so I have a view about what the internal inconsistency is. I don't think there's a sort of single issue that Kleiman is talking about. So there's a sort of central mistake that he thinks people are making, which is the thing that Lexi just referred to, the simultaneous dual system versus temporal single system stuff. And that mistake leads to kind of a number of different mistakes, one of which is the sort of, the famous results in the history of Marxist theory, Akicio's theorem, the sort of stuff around the tendency of rate of profit to fall, stuff around, Bortkiewicz. And I mean, each of these, there are similarities between all of these, but they're not all of the same problem. Or rather, it's not obvious to me that it's just a single issue repeating itself. But Kleiman's, that's not Kleiman's view. Kleiman's view is that all of these different issues, which can be expressed mathematically in different ways, come from this basic conceptual mistake of seeing, value and price as determined independently, and inputs and outputs being valued simultaneously. Right, so that's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is that I don't know how much emphasis we want to put on this notion of logical inconsistency. So the claim is certainly not that the theory is gibberish in the Wittgensteinian analytic philosophies, right? I don't think people are claiming that.
Right.
Marx is trying to utter claims that language cannot express, or things of this kind, right? I take it the claim is that. I mean, I shouldn't say the claim right before I've tried to suggest that there isn't a single claim. But the claims are something like, there are central kind of empirical claims the theory makes about, I mean, not just empirical, there are central kind of modeling claims the theory makes, which don't turn out to be true for, given assumptions that, modeling assumptions that we should expect the theory to have. So, for instance, this could be anything from, the rate of Marx said the rate of profit would fall if you model, value production this way. Guess what, kiddo? Given your assumptions, it doesn't fall, right? So that's going to be like one kind of claim of inconsistency. Another kind of claim of inconsistency is going to be like, prices converge to values. Guess what, dude? That doesn't happen. You said it would happen, but it doesn't happen, right? Things of this kind, right?
Right. So
okay.
What I'm getting at is logical validity, not logical consistency. Like, supposedly Marx's conclusions do not follow from his premises.
Yeah.
So this idea that, what is it? Socrates is a man and Socrates is Greek, therefore he's a philosopher. Socrates was a philosopher, but the logic doesn't follow. I don't want to. I think we should kind of stay away so much right now, Amog, if you don't mind, just from the actual ins and outs of all of the arguments, and let's try and develop them as we come, because I'm afraid that people will be lost already before we actually discuss what it actually is we're talking about yet.
So all I wanted to say, Tom, was that it's important to just. The reason I bring out the arguments is just to see that these are not, so to speak, airy-fairy philosophical arguments about whether Marx is making sense or not.
Absolutely.
Right? That's all I wanted to say.
Yeah, like they're kind of core, simple. It's a simple argument. He's either consistent or he's not consistent. And we'll try our best to figure out whether we think he's consistent or not reading this book. Is that a reasonable way to sum it up?
Absolutely. And it's, I mean, and also just a little note on logical, just let's not put too much stress on that. I think a lot of these concerns are just partly concerns about whether the economy behaves in a certain way. They're not simply logical concerns. That's all I want to say.
Right.
Yeah, fair. Very good. Right, what's next? Do we want to talk about maybe the Whig history and what that's about? Lexi, do you want to have a go at Whig history, or are we skipping over chapter 1.5? Why this particular book? Is there anything particular in that people want to talk about?
So let's see. We kind of just had a discussion about the importance of internal inconsistency. And oh yeah, what about the influence of internal inconsistency? Because I think this is this is interesting because he's just so sort of going through how much this is common sense. For just a lot of, for not just like, you know, the New York Times, but for like New Left Review, right? Like even somebody like Robert Brenner, who is an economist I have a tremendous amount of respect for. He kind of changed the game. He's an economic historian, you might say. But he's like one of the biggest Marxists in academia, one of the biggest Marxist economists, one of the biggest Marxist theories of crisis. And when he's reconstructing Marx's theory of crisis, he's not using the law, the crisis law that Marx sets out in Volume 3. He thinks that doesn't hold for these mathematical reasons, even though he's defending the empirical kind of overall crisis theory, which is fascinating. I think that's a fascinating point that Kleinman's putting forward here.
Who was this we were talking about? Richard Wolff, is it?
No, this is Brenner. This is Robert Brenner.
Such is the power of the Accusio theorem.
Wolff is not too different here.
Wolff, I think.
Wolff is an underconsumptionist, but yeah. I'm not sure what Brenner is.
No, Brenner. The best thing I could say, and maybe I'm not giving him enough credit, is that he's kind of constructed a bunch of ad hoc crisis tendencies in order to get around his models not allowing for a fall in the rate of profit through technical change. And
fair enough.
That probably makes it sound like I don't respect the guy, but I really do.
Yeah, anyway. Like one thing I'd like to say is that there, like before we like, if people think we're just like slagging off all Marxists, like I think a lot of the people who are Marxists who do think that there is inconsistency, some of them do great work, you know, and it shouldn't be seen as if like we're slagging all their work. I don't know if people.
And there was something called Marxism that, you know, up through the 80s, which, I mean, a lot of it was, you know, really nuts. Like, and it was a whole state, at least one state, you know, a huge world state being propped up by it that fell, and it all looked pretty dumb. And so you had even a lot of people that were true believers or commies or whatever, like be like, well, shit, I guess it's time for me to grow up intellectually, be intellectually honest. Like there was a big old thing called Marxism that fell, and it took a, you know, when that went, it took Marx's reputation with it. And maybe that I'm defending some people that weren't as intellectually rigorous as I'd hope, but I think it's important to stress how big just the world historic kind of depression of the left has in disorienting our ability to make sense of the world. And that's why it's so important to go back to this kind of
to basics.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Go back to the root. Okay, so will we move on to the Whig history? Anybody know anything about Whig history?
What?
Well, it's a term in historiography, and it's like historiography of science in particular, where it's basically like an uncharitable way to talk about how people tend to project progress onto the history of science. Thomas Kuhn, the philosopher of science, has a lot of resonances with this. I'm not sure if he uses the term Whig history, but yeah, basically there's this view held by, I think, Kant, but also by Engels, that science just gets closer and closer to the truth. Like, really showing off my math chops here. but what is that? An infinitesimal? That thing that just
asymptotic.
Thank you. An
You're
asymptote.
welcome.
A limit.
Right. It just keeps getting closer and closer to the truth, while never quite getting there. So that's this idea of Whiggish history, that when you look back at the history of science, or the truth is what propels the history of science forward, and we're getting closer and closer. It's not sociological, and for Marxists to believe something like that is particularly offensive.
Yeah. I think so he says, Whig history is, one, written from the perspective of those who currently hold power, and two, assumes that the present is necessarily better than the past, which is also what you said, Lexi. But I think sort of the importance of this sort of chapter on Whig history, or one of them rather, there are many points to be made. But one of them is this sort of, standing on the shoulders of giants thing that economics professors or historians or even yeah, exactly, or even us on the left, right, usually assume that we are at a point now where we know so much more, and they must be right. Yeah, exactly. And you create this sort of historical narrative that, oh, we used to believe X, but now we know X is wrong because person Y said that was inconsistent. And so we sort of assume that we're always critiquing things from a superior point of view, instead of actually going back to the original text and try to steelman them, as it were, which I think is a really sort of neat thing. I think this section on Whiggish history is sort of really got to me, actually, because I'm certainly guilty of this as well. Like, oh, all the things I used to believe are bullshit. Might be worth going back to the things I used to believe and seeing if they're if I just interpreted my old heroes incorrectly, as it were.
And the phrase was introduced by Paul Samuelson, Kleiman says, at least into economic history. And apparently he's a proud sort of Whig historian. He believes that there's something to this view. And I think if you are thinking of histories of cumulative knowledge, one will be sympathetic that there's some kind of build up. But I think for something this politically charged, it's very difficult for the social brain to process this properly.
Yeah, like economics doesn't function as a science. It's too much power relations going on involved for it to be done rationally. I always find it amusing that all the economists were value theorists until like Capital came out, and then they all became utilitarians. God, that's some coincidence. It's interesting now, in this chapter here, he talks about how Paul Samuelson in the 70s came out with like basically what was the fundamental basic of the critique of Marx's economics, because in the 70s people were getting very radical, and we had SDS in America and all these Maoists and truck groups everywhere during the war in Vietnam and stuff like that. And Samuelson came out and did an extensive critique of Marx. And it's interesting that Kleiman kind of basically says that this critique was the thing that all of these other schools of Marxian thought essentially emanated out of, which is interesting.
The example he uses is, or that he points to Freeman, is that the so-called Copernican revolution in science, where instead of thinking that the sun revolves around the earth, we come back to the view that the earth revolves around the sun. Well, the point being that this was an older hypothesis. This revolution in science was sort of a return to a previous hypothesis that, as he says, He quotes Feyerabend, the philosopher of science.
Yeah.
Theories are abandoned and superseded long before they've had an opportunity to show their virtues.
That's certainly true.
I think it perfectly illustrates the lion, the man and the lion fable, though, because that's exactly what it's a cautionary tale about, is that you build a statue that historicizes a specific fact, which is that the man is stronger than the lion, and that's written by the victor, basically.
Yeah.
And this is just to leading this whole chapter with that is basically saying that this is the cautionary. This is exactly what the fable is made for, to warn against that tendency.
You know, mathematical economists aren't supposed to be very philosophically sophisticated, but I found this to be a pretty good reflection of philosophy of science. And yeah, I don't know. He clearly thinks that these issues are like that. The qualitative issues are more important, but he just wants to get this quantitative stuff out of the way. It's another thing he says. Like, this quantitative stuff is important so that we can carry on to the real important philosophical shit.
Yeah, it's quite startling because, like, when you read this book, it's extremely, some places, you know, it's very logical, it's very mathematical in some places, and it's really trying to make a very clear argument. But at the start of the book, Andrew says in it that it's actually, this stuff he feels is, you know, quite a bit secondary to the politics that it talks of and what it could lead to, which is kind of
right.
It's surprising when you know, when you stick your head through all this book and you get to the end, you know, you don't leave the book with that impression. But you know, that's his politics. He talks a bit. He goes into some of these tactics about what type of arguments they make. I don't think, do people want to discuss this? I don't think there's too much point in going into detail here.
I just think they are some really neat examples that could be worth bringing up. Like again, Thomas Kuhn, or no, sorry, Sharrock and Reed. The point about a particular kind of Whiggish history, where the speaker or the teacher, the professor or the Whig historian tries to make every previous thinker sound like they are just sort of more stupid versions of the professor. The predecessor is made to look rather like oneself. This particular Whiggish strategy is the most effective if it can be pulled off, for it then becomes impossible to read predecessors as themselves. They read rather as if they've been trying to be you all along, as if they've read you but ill understood you. So again, sort of this technique whereby the Whig historian proclaims themselves to be the final arbiter of, like, the cumulative, the end point of history, you know, going back and critiquing all the sort of stupid people before him, which is
no, there's something like that. He makes this point that people are quoting very particular passages without respect to the entire work, you know, to make your argument work. And that's definitely, I think, at work when we get through to some of the stuff later on. I certainly feel like that there are, you know, sentences taken, one sentence here to justify a whole schematic of a model, while in reality that completely contradicts core elements of Marx's work, say, for example. But yeah, so, like, you know, that's pretty important stuff. So what's the next then? He does talk a little bit about pluralism in only one path forward.
Yeah, because this is the deal with the idea that the TSSI and proponents of the TSSI are accused of dogmatism. Now, it should be said that, you know, the public persona on the internet of Kleiman, shall we say, is pugnacious, right? And that sort of leads a lot of people, and to have this attitude of like, look, there's a true thing in Marx's book, right? Like, to have that attitude and to be as, let's say, pugnacious as Kleiman can be online. A lot of people, I think, discount that this claim might actually be true because they see someone like very serious about it. Does that make sense? Like, people associate nuance with uncertainty, right? It's thinking about something with skepticism and a lack of conviction, right?
Yeah.
And without getting into more personal critiques, I do think that like this whole intellectual fetish of uncertainty and a lack of conviction is one of the worst things maybe to cultivate. Like, I don't know.
So, yeah, left activism and science in general.
Yeah.
I like people who are clear in what they talk about, and you can then pretty much make up your idea whether they're wrong or not, by looking into it. But at least they argue a specific case in detail. I admire that kind of, strength of conviction and actual intellectually backing it up.
Yeah, like it's the person who's putting forward the theory, thinks it's true.
Yeah, like I love listening to I don't know anything about linguistics, but I do listen to like big long lectures by Chomsky on technical linguistic stuff, and I love the way he just thrashes other linguists. He'll just go, this is obviously complete nonsense, and you kind of go, God, it's pretty harsh, but like he backs it up with argument, and it's kind of like what if we were sitting around in a pub discussing something, we would probably thrash each other. But I like that kind of style, I must say.
Yeah, I'm not as into it as maybe you are, Tom. So
shut up.
There's, but like I think it's important also to like talk about, or I don't know if we should talk about it, but just maybe think about how we talk about stuff a lot on the left, especially us like on the quote unquote podcast left, because a lot of times I feel that we tend to do our own sort of Chomskyite Whig history, right? That we all have our own sort of enclaves where you're supposed to think that, oh, this and this thinker is bullshit because I read another thinker that we like more now. Or, one day Chris Catrone is the new hot stuff, and then day two, everyone's supposed to hate him. And
yeah,
a lot of times, like listening to leftist podcasts, it's sort of like, do you want to hang with the cool gang or do you want to hang out with the loser gang? And like
that's definitely massive case on the left.
Yeah.
What is the trendiest new hot take on Marx?
Exactly. And so I'm sorry I interrupted you, Tom, but I just need to get this out before I forget it.
You're right. I interrupted you first, so you're okay.
All right. Okay. But like, so a lot of times we tend to say, I know I'm making this up, but Kautsky's theory on social revolution was bullshit. Why? Because Julia Kristeva said this, right? Or something. Like a lot of times we make arguments by reference in order to sort of paint ourselves as cool thinkers that, if you just read this person that I've read, you would also understand why Kautsky is bullshit or something. And I feel that one of the strengths with this book is that Kleiman actually walks us through step by step the entire argument, making himself open for critique, etc. And the sort of secure rhetoric that someone like Chomsky might have, for instance, doesn't really open up for a fair critique, and I think also scares people off because they don't understand the argument that everyone's arguing against, and all they hear is that, okay, in order to be so apparently this Kristeva person is a better thinker than Kautsky, so I don't have to read Kautsky because he has been disproved. Like, am I making sense?
Oh,
Yeah,
that makes sense.
absolutely. I mean, I think the sort of the right impulse is usually just to just, whenever you're trying to put forward a view, to try to give what we might call a good error theory, to try to have some understanding of why people might disagree with you and how they might come to a different position, even if you think they're wrong, right? So the effort, I mean, and I think strangely enough, Kleiman does this in the book. I say strangely enough because, like, I'm not used to. Alexei mentioned the difference between, you know, the sort of the weird online persona. Kleiman does this in the book much better than certain people who like Kleiman a lot do this in person, where it's, the reason that I'm not so keen on all this kind of, what do you call this sort of punch-up style of academic debate is because I think that beyond a certain point, it kind of diminishes understanding, right? I'm much more interested in getting a sense of not just the right position, but also why it is the case that everyone has not automatically converged to the right position. And that question is as important as, what the right position is. And I mean, people sometimes, when people have very simplistic answers as to why everyone else is wrong, so for instance, intellectual dishonesty, they're lying, or things of this kind, that's generally just a good, pragmatically speaking, indicator that, they don't, not that they're wrong, but that they may not have the complete picture. So I just think that this is just good intellectual due diligence, that, when you make the basic assumption that everyone else is not stupid, and when you do that, it falls upon you to give some account as to when you say that a person is wrong, provide a sort of charitable explanation for why they might be wrong, right? This, of course, doesn't mean that ideology doesn't play a role. This doesn't mean that people can't be stooges of power. But, the more you help yourself to that kind of explanation, the easier it is for you to dismiss any counter argument. As an example of, sort of intellectual and sociological pathology. So I mean, it's generally important not to do that all the time.
That was amazingly well put, Amo. Thank you. Thank you very much for that. That was great.
Yeah, that's totally brilliant because it captures both what I like about this book, because in a way, this whole book is a big error theory about Marxist economics. But also what I have like some misgivings about, because I don't understand why, communists would adopt neoclassical theory without trying to defend Marx.
Right.
I feel like there must be some kind of scientific reason or intuition that they found this move plausible.
Right. I should just note that it's possible to take this to extremes. I'm by no means saying that everyone is right, or that you have to come up with some convoluted explanation as to why everyone is right. This is a kind of rule of thumb, etc.
But that's what makes a charitable pluralist view of things.
Yeah.
I think good.
One thing I would say, just Lexi, about why did they have this shift to, say, bourgeois economics, the Marxists, I would say that it was typically done by Marxists in the West. That same shift, I don't think occurred behind the Iron Curtain.
Yeah.
And if you look at, say, the centers of where it happened most in England was in, I think, Cambridge, was with Straffa, who was a pal of Keynes. So there's probably a hell of a lot of reasons why it occurred in the West, and why it occurred in America with Sweezy, who was both Sweezy and Samuelson,
Yeah, but what I'm trying to
Harvard.
What I'm trying to say is I'm not sure I understand the broader scientific reasons for making that move. And the one that I could graft onto it is that you can do more complex, higher level maths if you make that simplifying assumption.
Say that again. What do you mean?
Okay, so one of the assumptions that this book is going to take aim at is this equation of input costs and output costs, to speak very bluntly, right? And that's thought to be some kind of grounding methodological equilibrium, right? And it's my understanding that when you're doing, I don't know, higher level calculus, or actually when I see like the models that mathematical economists build, like, and this isn't so much true for the newer computer modeling, so maybe this is going to be an obsolete comment, right? But like the kind of math that they're building on borrow from population biology, which is all about this like clearing of like clearing of a sort of like market to an equilibrium. I find it very hard to describe, actually. Like I said, I don't have my mind wrapped around all this and why this is happening more generally. So that's just to respond to the whole error theory thing. Like, why would economists make this move? Are we too far off track, or is this making sense to people?
I think it's good. Why would they make that move? Well, I'd say there's a lot of political pressure on them to make that move, given the time that's in it. And I think, like, if there is arguments for why he's inconsistent, I do think that a lot of you can make hay in your career by going down some other route. I think there's an awful lot to be said for that. I really do. Because
when I walked away from this book, I thought of this move that he's calling simultaneous valuation as an encoding of something called Say's law. Say's law was an early controversy in classical political economy. And I say it's a controversy, but really there are only a few people that made arguments against it. Sismondi, who I don't really understand that well, but also famously Thomas Malthus, who had this who didn't think, so I should say that Say's law is the idea that supply creates its own demand, right? Is that
that's it.
Say's law says that every purchase is a sale and every sale is a purchase.
Right.
Thus,
which is
crises shouldn't be able to happen, I think is where Say ends up at the end of that argument. And one of the people who responded to it was Malthus, and another was Marx, and his argument against Say's law was hoarding, if I recall correctly.
In the most famous horseshoe theory ever, both Malthus and Marx were like, Say's law is bullshit.
Yeah.
Lexi loves a horseshoe.
I do. It's lucky.
Yeah. So, so it is a bit strange, but like I would just think that, it's kind of an inevitable thing. If we're actual Marxists, we should be looking at the economic conditions for having their effect on, and the political conditions affecting the science.
Absolutely. That set of intuitions is why I'm a Marxist. However, that only serves me so well in analytical matters. Eventually, even bourgeois scientists will have their reasons for adopting new methodologies. Like, even if we think that some concerns in evolutionary biology were driven by ideology, it doesn't mean that, I don't know. I'm thinking about the Lysenko debate in the Soviet Union, the Lysenko thing, and Stalin propping up shitty science, and I don't know.
But look, you only have to look at modern non-Marxist economics, say standard utility theory, that it's absolutely and utterly riddled with fallacy. None of the empirics backs it up. How does it survive if it was actually a science?
That's true. But
if it was physics, it would be in the bin.
But it's true for the whole discipline.
Yeah,
Tom,
absolutely. But more
you're
discipline.
being a Whig historian now.
I'm being the opposite because I'm saying all the new stuff is bad and the old stuff's good.
Yeah, but you need to give us reasons. Like I'm perhaps the person who's the most sympathetic to bourgeois economics here. So
Why is that? Have you done a degree in it?
Yeah, please explicate for me here.
Well, so when I say like bourgeois economics, what I mean is business economics. When it comes to macroeconomics, it's a completely different deal. I don't know why these two fields don't talk more with each other, because their assumptions are completely incompatible.
Yeah, I would say that Kleiman would say that business economics is much closer to the truth.
Yeah, and it's a lot
theoretical
closer.
stuff.
Yeah, so I'm studying business economics now, and like so from the point of view of procurement and logistics and purchasing and stuff, and it's just my entire background in economics. I haven't read a single textbook in economics. All I've read in economics is Reclaiming Marxist Capital, like Kleiman's books, Freeman's articles, and Capital volumes 1 and 2. Right, so that's my entire background. And business, there are, like, as far as I can tell, up until now, there aren't really any points where they contradict. In fact, so like maybe we should get to this more in chapter 2, but like so in logistics, when you look at how say you look at a factory and you're making jeans, right? You want to know in all the points that the raw material goes through until it becomes jeans. You want to know how much value is added.
Yeah.
Because and the core assumption is the jeans can only increase in value if someone's actually working on it.
Yeah.
If it's so, and it's the exact same argument. Value is transferred from the machines, but only living labor in a certain station can add new value. That's built into the core of logistics theory. So that's just like one example.
Yeah, like I agree completely with you. Like it's when you get into theoretical stuff, they don't take, like, you would never run your business like say marginal theory would say. They've done like loads of empirical stuff and say that it's actually the opposite. Marginal theory is not how businesses do it. You know, and look at how they actually say it. They actually call it added value.
Yes.
You know, that's not a coincidence. So like
it's not.
I would completely agree with you that if you're working in a business and if you were to explain how Marxist economics to them, or if you were to look at business economics, they will line up nearly exactly.
Yeah.
But not economic theory.
Right, but here's the weird part is that they will be sort of inconsistent about it, but they will so like for instance, we were sort of explicitly taught that value cannot be created in exchange, because that's a core assumption behind all of accounting theory. If value can be created in exchange, then balance sheets don't make sense, because you could, oh my God, this is becoming very technical, but if that were true, if marginal utility theory were true, then it would be completely incompatible with basic accounting practice. It just cannot work in an actual business. So we were taught this with sort of semi-Marxist lingo, actually.
This is a good foray into the next chapter. Why don't we walk from that into this?
Cool.
Because it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Like and I don't have any disagreements with what you're talking about. I agree wholeheartedly. And even when it comes to the debate on the falling rate of profit, which we'll hit later, about how they actually calculate their profit is actually the way Kleiman and these guys say it should be, and Marx would say it should be done, which is on historical cost.
It's the way
and
any person who would want to value a stock looks at profitability. It's
absolutely
so again, like where do these neoclassical people come from? Like I don't understand it. It's not from the rich people. Like the rich people go to business school, and they all operate under the assumption of some kind of labor theory of value. So
like, okay, because my intuition here is, well, I guess these economics people are just ideologues. And I think that feels like a too simple conclusion. It feels like it's a very satisfying conclusion, right? Yeah. These people are just stooges, man. Right?
Yeah, like you seem to be very reluctant to it. I don't have any reluctance whatsoever.
Well, I mean, I think that's true on the whole, but is there anything else?
Well, here, let me just say this. Like, before I got into Marx and all this stuff, around 2000 and like, what was it, 6 or 7, I went on holidays to the States with my folks, and we're coming back. And I used to be one of these economist reading dudes, who thinks that's the height of knowledge. And I was coming back, and there was like, I'd read like 6 months before, there was some like puff piece on Obama in The Economist, and I was coming through the airport, and there I saw was Obama's Audacity of Hope, right? And I was like, oh God, I'm going to read this. And I bought it and I read it at home. And you read it all. And I read it at the time, and you could tell that he was like a very good writer, and he was like a very smart guy and all that. But I fell for all his bullshit. 100% fell for all his stuff before I ever had any kind of radical politics exposure. But it's like, when I read that book, like now, I would laugh at all the things that would be in it. And I would say, well, he's obviously just a stooge and he's full of it when he does this.
Well, but that's a campaign book, right? That's a campaign book. That's not the textbook coming out of Oxford, right?
But like, think about like, how could an entire like science of economics go from labor theory and go off to utility marginalist theory? Like, that's like a jump, like from classical physics to relativity, to general relativity. Like, one actually end up working. When they do a big shift like that, it's usually about what it can prove. And like, how can the new one be less good than the old one? Like, I just think that it's pure power in politics. I don't see why you have such reluctance to believe that all these guys, knowingly or not, are just stooges.
Amog, what's your error theory here? Because that's why I think this is a useful concept, right?
Yeah, so I'm just not sure we're gonna be able to get into this here. I mean, I'm really like, I'm not.
Mute mics, please.
Oh.
Yeah. So, what to say? I guess what I was initially saying was not that there aren't bankrupt paradigms, right? My thought was, I was making a very much simpler point that when you want to give a criticism of a view, you want to give as much as possible an account of what the view gets right as well as what the view gets wrong, right? And I still think that that maxim isn't affected at all by whatever is the case about neoclassical economics, because it's a sort of general intellectual rule of thumb, which doesn't stand or fall based on the fact that power politics happens or doesn't affects or doesn't affect the course of the sciences. So that said, I find a useful example. So I think that giving a sort of careful, there are cases where you can give error theories and your opponents can be ideologues, right? Like, it's not obvious to me that those two things are inconsistent.
Right, that's what I'm looking for.
So the easiest, so I'm not going to defend mainstream economics in any way. I have basically the same view as Tom about what's up there. I don't think there is. I mean, I think that the question as to why people keep doing it. There are a range of different things to say, right? So one thing is that there's a range of different subfields where people undertake tiny little projects, which are sometimes very empirical, and people find it useful to use certain models to just demonstrate certain kinds of very local conclusions. And there's a little bit of like, paradigm sharing there. Paradigm sharing that goes on, as with every science, where it's like not everyone is doing the kind of big picture theorizing, and there's all kinds of little things to say. But I mean, I think that it's basically true that there's nothing. Okay, so sorry. Let me just walk things back a couple of steps. So two things. One, it's useful to look at sort of Marx's critique of classical economics, and how he thought that, Ricardo and Smith were plainly ideologues, yet he was able to give this very kind of interesting reconstruction of their views, yes. Right? And, talk about how they were getting it, in fact, I think what's really cool is that on the Marxist account of like what it is to be an ideologue, there is a sense in which, in order to claim someone to be an ideologue, they have to be representing the world correctly in some way, yeah. Right? But simply from a particular class perspective, right? So this is what's the case for someone like Smith and Ricardo, right? So from the Marxist point of view, Smith and Ricardo are giving, so to speak, the bourgeois point of view on what an economy would look like if it was set up to conform to their interests and to, further their interests over time. And thus there is in some sense something right about it, because it accurately represents, albeit in a mystified way, what bourgeois interests are, right? So, I mean, I think that something similar could be said for neoclassical macroeconomics. Like, you could analyze it not in terms of, so to speak, the truth or falsity of its views, which are important, but in terms of how that kind of discourse allows, central banks to function, play the role that they do, allows economists to tell politicians to, I don't know, cut spending in recessions and, worsen the lot of the working class, things of this kind, right? And in that, and in order for neoclassical economics to play even that ideological role, it seems like there is sort of, it's getting the bourgeois perspective right? It seems to me that the Marxist, that would be the Marxist thing to say. That would be like the error theory, right? It's like, why are people saying this? Well, listen, they're representing the world as it should look like in order to comfort this particular kind of class interest.
Yeah, I take that as sort of axiomatic. I'm just sort of I'm preparing us to delve into 18th century political economy language. Like, I think for a lot of people, if they know a little bit about economics, they get confused by, we're doubling back here.
Yeah.
And
I mean, I would also say that I think it is misleading to. I actually, my view is that there's not that much of a discontinuity in the end between a bunch of sort of reactionary stuff that classical political economy used to say and a bunch of reactionary stuff that contemporary macroeconomics says. I mean, this is not, obviously it's not a very great insight. People have pointed this out quite a lot. But, anyway, sorry, I don't know where I was going with that. So I think we could just, I'm happy to just stop things there.
Great. I think we're ready to move on to Marx's value theory now that we've sort of addressed the question, why would anyone abandon the frameworks of classical political economy to begin with, or develop them, depending on your point of view.
Hopefully we cleared that up.
Oh yeah, we solved that one.
I'm finding myself being very I'm finding myself being very hardcore in this, so I'm gonna have to tone down my hardcoreness. But
no. It's a good counterpoint. You know, I mean, like I'm trying to be as because look, at the end of the day, I think this is correct, but I don't just want to be I don't want to be a dogmatic Marxist. I want to take on like the most pluralism I can, because I think at the end of the day, this carries it. I don't think this is threatened by pluralism.
yeah, no, I think we should try and be as correct as we can, and also but not be assholes. I don't know.
So
Yeah,
let's.
The aim is not. The aim is not to. The aim is just it's to be as correct as we can. And I would take it that like part of being correct is like showing why other people are wrong as convincingly as we can. That's really it. It's not very complicated.
Anyway, here let's jump into what Marx's value theory is for people that have got this far. Hopefully they'll still be with us and we'll have a chat about it. So one thing that Kleiman kicks off here with it, he makes the point that Marx's value theory is about it's not a theory of price, and it's not a general explanation of why goods and services have price, that it's literally about the production of commodities for exchange, commodity production, which is an important point. Is one that when I first came to Marx's theory, I had all these different ideas about like what's the value of say, you know, doing a painting or writing a joke or whatever, that they really, you know, usually they don't have any value, that we're talking about repetitive commodity production, and that's what drives the economy. The economy is primarily about making shoes and cups of tea and microchips and all that type of stuff, and that's what Marx is actually analyzing.
Yeah, and I think it's also Kleiman makes the very important point that it's not a theory generally of exchange. Like Marx's theory is very particular to a very specific economy, and doesn't try to, you know, go to barter island as the joke might be for other sort of economic schools that try to have a one-stop shop theory of all exchange and all possible economies. Marx's value theory is only applicable to a very, very, very specific type of economy where things are produced for the purpose of being exchanged.
Yeah, and also like he talks about how the means of production are owned by capitalists, and how competition comes into it. It's about competitive exchange. He also gives an example then about the Trobriand Islands, where they were basically a kind of a more caste system based production, where things weren't being exchanged based on how much labor that was in them, that they were just exchanged based on your position in society. One guy is in charge of doing this, another family are in charge of doing that, and things were exchanged on that basis.
Yeah, this is an important point because the classical economists were often read, if they intended this, I'm not sure, as just giving general theories of what all economic activity is like everywhere in human history. And sometimes Stalinists, and I think this is who Kleiman has in mind, like Stalinist economists, would take that on too. You know, would not read Marx as a theorist particularly of capitalism, but is, you know, doing like a whole history of a model of economic activity before capitalism in value terms.
Yeah, I think also he's taken on the bourgeois economists,
Yeah.
because they definitely have the idea of, you know, the famous idea of Robinson Crusoe on his island, you know,
right,
making coconut shells and exchanging them for fish or something, you know. So he's taken on both of them, but he's trying to make the case that it's to do also, you know, also the competitive nature. So let me see, I'm not being exactly clear. He breaks up value into basically in labor into two types of labor. under capitalism. He breaks it up into concrete labor. So this is the idea that, say you're at home in your house and you decide to bake a cake, your concrete labor is of baking that cake. But also then this idea that Marx has of abstract labor. And this is, say, labor, say, for example, that you are not just going to eat that cake in your house, you're going to sell that cake in the market. At that point, the price that you're going to be able to get will be this kind of abstraction from your own simple labor and this averaging over all the cake makers in the country and how much labor they take to do it. So you got this kind of dual aspect of labor. We've got concrete labor, which is the kind of actual labor to do the thing, and then we've got this abstract labor, which is abstracted away, and it's an average over everybody's labor doing that similar type of labor.
Yeah, and what's
sorry, go ahead, Lexi.
Yeah, just what's important about abstract labor is that it creates value in this world of commodities. And it's important to distinguish the cake itself and the concrete labor of the cake and the pleasure of eating the cake from the production of a commodity and the buying and selling of a commodity. And while when you bring the cake home from the market, you eat it and you're appreciating its use value, or you have a specific type of qualitative wealth. What this theory is concerned with is the quantitative value on the market and how the market pressures create an emergent determination of value by labor time.
Absolutely. So we have these ideas of use value, which is the usefulness of the object, and we have the exchange value, which is the price. And Marx has as well the actual value, he calls it, which is the amount of socially necessary labor time involved in making that cake. So for me, that's always a tricky phrase. Socially necessary labor time is basically the average amount in the economy to take that of labor that it takes to make that cake. So the average for that cake is 3 hours. That's the value of that cake. And
it's important. It's useful to note, and Kleiman does towards the end of section 2.1.2, that the idea that value is socially necessary labor time is not a definition. I think this is very useful to note. It's supposed to be this like generalization that holds once, as Lexi says, like market dynamics have played themselves out in particular ways. Sorry, not market dynamics, but capitalist dynamics.
Yes.
Right? Yeah, it's an empirical.
All right, so yeah, explain that again, Ahmad, because I was reading that there today and it struck me as strange. So explain that again.
Right. So I think the thought is that we're thinking. So what is the claim here? The claim here is that the exchange value of the commodity, what it exchanges for, right, is determined by the amount of labor needed to produce it, right? So what a commodity exchange is for is determined by the social average of the cost of production expressed in labor time, right? Is the claim, I mean, I take it that the claim is that, I mean, I think I want to read this in terms of the value of the exchange value of a commodity converging over time, or at least like, converging, maybe read that in like a modeling sense, to the social average, given, maybe 1 or 2 cycles of, economic activity. Because you might think that exchange value and socially necessary labor time can diverge, right? You might think that, anyway, yeah. Does that
okay,
make
so yeah, so let me see if let me just try and put this and see if I have it right. That he's saying that this idea that the commodity's value is determined by the socially necessary labor time, he's not saying that's a definition that always has to be true. He's saying that this is what, if you look to the marketplace, is what is actually going on that we see empirically. That's the kind of idea he's trying to say.
Yeah,
correct.
And so
Fire ahead.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. So I just have two things. One is we're not yet talking about exchange value. We're talking about value.
Yes.
This is going to be really important later on in the text. So he's not saying, Kleiman is not saying, Marx's theory that a commodity's exchange value is determined by the amount of labor needed to produce it has often been construed as a definition of the commodity's value, but this is incorrect, blah, blah, blah. He's saying Marx's theory that a commodity's value is determined by the amount of labor needed to produce it, et cetera, et cetera. To someone who's new to Marxist value theory, this might seem like, well, okay, what's the big deal? It is a big deal, because Marx, and you hinted at this too, Tom, there are many economic thinkers before Marx that differentiated between use value and exchange value, right? However, Marx's deal is that Marx also makes a distinction between exchange value and value, and those are those can be two very different magnitudes in Marx's value theory. So we're not, at this point in the actual text, we're not dealing yet with exchange value. Kleiman doesn't mention that term. He talks about value, just so we're super
That's true.
Anal about
He
this.
Does, you know. He does talk about price, though. And
yes.
Price is exchange value.
Yeah, price is exchange value expressed in money.
Yeah.
Yes, that's the one time he mentions it, but it's super important to be very careful.
It's true, and if it's possible, there's some. I've never liked the phrase, the term use value, for the very Marxist reason that use value is really referring to wealth that is not really part of the commodity value system.
Yes. Let's be explicit there what we mean by wealth, because people get confused by this normally.
Well, the reason that people are confused is because this distinction is not there in bourgeois economics. Value is wealth, right? And what Marx is trying to say is that, well, there's this qualitative thing. It's the deliciousness of the cake. You know what I mean? It's this experience or this service or whatever it is. When you go into the world of value and commodities, you're abstracting from that. He says value is abstract wealth. So we're cleaving a world of these different qualitative wealths, these use. I'm going to call them utilities. I don't use the phrase use value. I think that's confusing.
I think he also talks about things like, the view of a place, being able to breathe clean air.
Yeah.
Your general, being able to be out in nature, and that there's a wealth to that, but there's not a value on it.
Well, it taps into this, this true, kind of folk wisdom that you can't put a number on everything. That there are just certain things that are it's just a matter of the quality of it, and that there's something about, and this gets into sort of the romantic part of Marxism, right? Is that capitalism is trying to rationalize everything, and it's going to miss something, and it's when it's encoding it, it's always going to miss something vital, and I think that's part of his critique of exploitation, how this all operates. Anyway.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm I just want to interject that even without any sort of romanticism or how should I put this? Even without any sort of romanticism, the thing use values are if you add up all of the use values in the commodity in an economy, you will have all of the economy's wealth. So total wealth equals total use values. Even if there is no romanticism about this, what it basically states is Like materially in this economy, people can breathe fresh air. There are everyone has access to a car. Basically, it's like it's living standards. It's what's actually materially there, like there actually, you know, there that people can use and that people like and whatnot. And all of these things are concrete and they're heterogeneous, right? So something might be totally useless to me, but of great use to you, right? So it's heterogeneous. It's people have different needs, and what counts as a use value is sometimes going to be completely individual. What happens in commodity production is that you also have this abstract component where it doesn't really matter what it is that you do or you own, right? So if you have a job, you don't really care that much about, you know, what it is you actually physically do. I mean, maybe you do, right? But at the end of the day, you're doing that in order to receive a certain amount of value. You're doing it to receive a certain magnitude of cash, as it were, and that's the abstract component. What he calls it abstract wealth as such, considered without regard to its specific physical form, is what he calls abstract labor. So all of these terms can get a bit confusing, but I just wanted to, like, even if we do away with all the fluffy stuff, it's still true that there are things actually there that we can use that don't necessarily have a price tag on.
That's really.
It will also be useful. I mean, just another kind of Marxist internal reason to not be fluffy, so to speak, is that, you know, we want to have an imminent critique of capital production, right? We want to, so to speak, criticize capitalism according to its own goals, its own assumptions, things of this kind, right? So the claim is, in fact, you know, and Lexi knows this claim as well as the rest of us, that capitalism is not in fact rational, right? That what we have here is only the appearance of rationality, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Anyway, I'm not gonna belabor this point. Sorry, Tom. Go ahead.
No, yeah, I thought it was a really good point that Emmanuel made there. As in, like, if you think about like what GDP is some kind of measure of, is the amount of labor or something that was performed in the economy in the last year, some kind of labor measure. But like, there's no labor in your pigeon population or the flies or the bumblebees that are outside. There's no labor measure of the air, and there's no labor measure of whether you have nice seaside or spectacular mountains. All these things that add to life that would be in that kind of, you know, sum of use values that Emmanuel was trying to talk about there, that aren't represented when we talk about commodity production and value. This is an entirely separate system. So
Yes.
we got to have that idea in our head. It's a very good way to think about it, I think. So just going on to the next thing about value transferred. Would you like to talk about this, Emmanuel? Because you're doing your business economics and you like your depreciating assets. Do you want to talk about this a bit?
All right. So maybe I don't know. Maybe we could put up my little sort of going through of this so that people could appreciate your joke, Tom. But, let's see, what page are we on? All right, so value transferred and new value added. So Kleiman is going to say that Marx said. Well, let's just say Marx says, and have it sort of immediately understood that whenever we say Marx says, we're sort of implying Kleiman says that Marx says. But the core sort of thing is that when you produce a commodity in a commodity economy, a capitalist economy, what is going to determine the value of that commodity? Well, one of the components is the value transferred by means of production. And this sounds super Marxist-y, but it's really just saying that if you buy a machine that doesn't need any sort of human input, it just automatically does things, right? Maybe, let's say, as as in that document. Let's say you buy a plumbus, right? Everyone needs a plumbus. And the plumbus is going to produce schlieb. And it produces schlieb all of its own, right? No labor is needed. No humans are needed anyway to make it produce schlieb. It just keeps on going. And let's say that a plumbus has a finite lifespan. So maybe a plumbus can produce schlieb for 10 years, right? All that what that's saying is that the value, the price that you acquired the plumbus for is going to be at the end of the lifespan, the entire this is actually wrong. Kleiman says this is wrong, but let's just run with it for the time being. The value of the plumbus, when you go to market and you buy the plumbus for say $1,000, at the end of its 10-year lifespan, its entire value is going to be converted into schlieb. So if you paid $1,000 for the plumbus, it makes schlieb for 10 years. At the end of that period, you have no plumbus, but you have a pile of schlieb. What is the value of that schlieb? Well, it's exactly equal to the amount you originally spent on the plumbus. So no additional value has been created. It has only been transferred throughout this period. And
so Emmanuel, when it comes to like accountancy, this is how accountants do it in their balance sheet, isn't it?
That's
in their profit and loss.
Yes,
that they actually.
Yes, the sort of exception to this would be like if you own houses or apartments or things like that, or you own something that you speculate on, like financial assets such as stocks or bonds or something. But in general, at least in Sweden, it's considered a criminal offense to assume that the plumbus is going to do anything else but convert its entire value into schlieb. You can't account for it in any other way by standard sort of accounting practice.
Wow.
So that's one component, and so this is one determinant of the value of the commodity, in this case the schlieb. But the other thing is that if we actually do something with it and we engage with it and we perform living labor, what Marx calls living labor on it, we add new value. So every commodity's value is one of the determinants is the value transferred by already performed labor, right? So any machine that you buy is going to be comprised entirely of already performed labor, because the work is done for you, right? You're purchasing the machine in its entirety. So that the sort of value or labor embodied in the machine is going to transfer all of its value over time. That's one component. And then you have the new value added by living labor. So you have value transferred that can never increase. The value transferred to the product can never increase what Kleiman says, and this is specific to the TSSI. This is specific to Kleiman's interpretation. The value of the commodity that is transferred from the machinery can never exceed the price you paid for it, right? Then
sorry, can I interrupt? That seems to me to be kind of a bit strange. I must say. Like, say for example, I'm going to make say if for example I'm going to make some shoes in the morning.
Yeah.
And I go, and instead of buying the leather, I steal the leather. Yeah.
Okay.
And then I sell I could do the shoes, and I sell my shoes.
Mm-hmm.
Now I think that like in that case, would my shoes not have the same value as a shoe that somebody actually paid a price for it?
Yeah, it would, but it might exchange for less. So
it wouldn't.
It still doesn't. So even if you stole it, right? it's still true that you have, I don't know, say you stole a couple of shoes worth $50, right? You go to the market, you find some nice shoes that you like. You see that the price tag on them is $50. You steal them and you add them to your closet. Now, it's still true, even though you didn't pay anything for it, it's still true that you own an asset, in this case, $50 worth of shoes in your closet.
But let's say I steal the leather and then I apply labor to the leather.
Yeah.
And the leather, let's say the leather should be worth £100 and I do £100 worth of extra labor on them.
Right.
So to me, those shoes will actually will sell for £200, and that would be the value of the shoe. Like,
well, the things can sell above or below their values. It still does not. Even if you steal the leather, it doesn't detract from the fact that you still own, in this case, £100 worth of leather, whether or not there was any transaction going on between you and the leather supplier.
Are we not getting caught in the weeds here? Because this is like a ceteris paribus model, right? This is all things remaining equal, right? Because the example that I have in my head is, okay, I buy my Plumb Bob from SimCity, and then I come home and I have a nice Plumb Bob. I paid 50 simoleons for it. And then SimCity goes to war with Farmville, and all the other Plumb Bobs are destroyed, and the price for Schleeb skyrockets. You know what I mean? But that's still not taking the ceteris paribus, the all things remaining equal thing, into account, right? Like, so the idea is that this is the ideal functioning of an economy. Marx's theory is much like the bourgeois theory he's critiquing and in my view superseding, in that this is the ideal average of capitalism. That if there was some kind of mitigating event, like the things that we're talking about, like, oh, you stole all of your you stole your stuff, that's not what he's talking about. He's talking about, like,
even
normal
if
operation.
that were true. So Tom, a good example of this that maybe will further elucidate my point, that this is true whether or not you steal anything, right? Imagine if you inherit a house, or you inherit a castle, or you inherit land, right? You have not paid anything for it, but you still own a set value that castle or land or whatever represents. The fact that you didn't pay for it has nothing to do with the fact that you still own an asset with a certain value attached to it.
Okay, yeah, I understand exactly what he's trying to say here. Sorry, and I was being very stupid. Let me just see if I say this right, because sometimes you read it and your head explodes and goes in the wrong direction. Yeah. And the reason why he's saying that it's the price is the thing that the value transfers is because things don't sell at their values; they sell at their prices. So so say for example, for some reason the leather, really the amount of labor that goes into the leather is, say, $20 per square meter, right? But it actually only sells at $10 per square meter. Okay, loads of different commodities don't sell at their prices. In fact, they will rarely ever sell at their actual value. They sell their prices, but not their value. Let me correct myself there. So when I go and do something to the leather and then I sell them, I sell them, say, for £50. I'm not selling the amount of full labor that's contained into that. I'm selling the price plus the price value of the labor that's been put into it, and that's the amount that they will be sold at. Have I made that very unclear, or is that clear?
Yeah, but even if everything sells at value, the value transferred by machinery or means of production is still going to be determined by the price.
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly what I'm trying to say. Yeah.
I don't know how far we will get into chapter 2, but this really, really matters. In fact, it's one of the core assumptions behind the TSSI, because if Marx's theory cannot make sense. Essentially, you run into consistency problems if you assume that the value transferred by machinery is related to the value of the machinery instead of the price you actually paid in the market.
Yeah.
This is a core thing with the TSSI that is hopefully going to make a lot more sense when we get to the end of chapter 2. But the TSSI interpretation is that the value transferred by the means of production is related to the price paid to acquire the means of production and not to their values.
Yes, and also to be very precise, at the moment that it enters production.
Yes, exactly. Yeah,
that's the most important point. But we'll get to that later on.
Thank you for clarifying that.
Quick question about the way this links up with Kleiman's terminology at the beginning of page 22. So are we thinking of price paid at the time of production? That's current cost?
So what for the TSSI, what it is if I buy leather today at $20 a square meter, and I don't actually start producing shoes with that leather until next week, by which time the price has gone down to $15. It's
right.
The $15 is the value that's going to be transferred on.
Right.
And
yeah.
that's what Marx said, and that's very important for when we get on later on to the getting into the detail of where this confusion about inconsistency lies. So it's not the price that you paid, it's the price of the commodity at the time of production begins.
Right.
Okay.
No, absolutely. So I get that. I'm just trying to figure out how that squares with what Kleiman actually says. I mean, I'm not saying it's inconsistent at all. I'm just a translation thing.
Do you want to read the bit? Do you want to read the bit there that you're, and then we'll talk about it more.
So the word needed serves to indicate that the amount of value transferred depends upon the current cost rather than the historical cost of the means of production, and B, the socially average expenditure on the means of production. So could you just translate that into the terms you guys were talking in?
Okay. So yes. I think the current cost, that's the current cost. So it's not what you paid for it, it's the value that will be transferred is the price that it currently is at the moment it enters production.
Got it.
Yeah. And the socially average expenditure on the means of production. So what does that mean? And that's just the price of the means of production.
Huh. Oh, that's
total prices spent on means of production in the entire economy.
Yeah. Oh, this makes me think of my the buying the plumbus from SimCity and then all the other plumbuses getting destroyed, right? I think I didn't understand this as well before you kind of broke it down, but like yeah, you use the current cost of the means of production and then the socially average expenditure. This all makes sense. This is something unique to the TSSI, is what you're saying, Emmanuel.
Yes, and so I was in a capital reading group with Andrew Kleiman, and he talked about this being one of the sort of contentions about the TSSI, because Marx problematically in volume 1 says that the value transferred relates to the value of the machinery, and or the value of the constant capital rather. And Andrew said that if I recall correctly, that this must be a mistake, right? If his theory is to make sense, then we need the TSSI, and for the TSSI to work, it needs to be the current price of the means of production. So there might actually be a typo there, but in Marx's original work, the word is actually the value of the means of production, and this is one of the sort of things that causes some stir or debate on Marx's theory.
And
Just
just
to-
sorry,
go- Go ahead.
just one thing. Sorry, and I think in places like Marx uses value in the term value interchangeably with price, like, and some places that I think it's in the book in a later chapter that he actually mixes up his lingo in a number of places or uses the term differently. So I think that's where a lot of confusion comes out of, because so much of it is like these terms like value are like already English language terms that don't have precise meaning, and it's easy to go wrong. I don't know if I'm right about that, but I think I am.
So just one last time so that I can get it right in Kleiman's terms. So the amount of value the amount of value transferred depends on how much you're paying for the means of production, so how much the means of production costs when you start producing, at the point of production, and how much people are spending across the whole economy on average on the means of production.
Right.
And both of these are like prices, money expressed in monetary terms.
Yes. So the key thing is sort of to reread the first sentence again and again and again until it starts making sense.
Right.
It's the value that is needed to acquire the means of production. So, and this goes exactly to what Tom said, with the example of the leather. When you start producing, what is the value needed to acquire the means of production that you're using? Does that make more sense? And that value is going to depend on these two things. One of them is the socially average expenditure and the means of production, right? That's going to be one of the things that determine the value needed to acquire the means of production at the point when you're actually starting to produce.
Can somebody explain that B bit to me? Because I don't know if I actually get that.
Okay, like once the bombs hit Sim City and Farmville and all the
use my shoes.
Most of the
use the goddamn shoes.
Most of the plum bob factories are destroyed, and plum bombs become extremely.
Emmanuel sent this document talking about plumber's and Schlieb. And what the fuck is this stuff? And I went on to Google, and it doesn't exist.
Well, Emmanuel is translating this into Simlish, obviously, which is why I chose Sim City. Okay,
go back to the shoes. Explain to me what B is in shoes.
Come on.
All right.
Everybody needs a plumbus. How it's made, the plumbus. Look it up.
Everybody does need a plumbus. Look, okay.
Explain shoes. B in shoes.
Oh, Christ. So I forget the actual details of the leather shoe example. The point is that
what is the socially average expenditure in the means of production? Why is that different than just the cost?
You know what? Great question. Why is that different than the current cost, socially average expenditure? Like what, in terms of current cost, that's assuming that that's also a socially average current cost. Like,
is that what he's saying? It's the average cost.
Or is that the difference, right? Because it's not said that this is a socially, well, but it has to be because the historical cost that you actually paid for it.
Historical cost, yeah, it's the current cost.
But is it the historical and current cost of that particular one, or is it do you hear what I'm saying? Yeah. Like, is it the current cost of my MacBook Pro or my MacBook Air, even though I kicked it once and that brought the value down, or is it the cost general of a MacBook Air that didn't get kicked? Yeah.
Right. So here, I think that was a really good question, Tom. And I think the way I make sense of this, not saying that it's right, but Kleiman repeatedly makes the point that current cost and replacement costs are not the same thing. Mm-hmm. So I think it's sort of him saying that what I mean by current cost is not, so replacement cost is something that a lot of insurance companies use, for instance. Okay, say you own a MacBook or you have a server room, right? And it burns down. Okay, so what is the value of those servers? and then the insurance company is going to look, well, what is the cost of replacing those? But that might be new computers, right, or something like that. So I think the B thing here is him saying that no, it's not the replacement cost. It's the socially average expenditure on the means of production. And it's unclear if he means the means of production aggregate, but I think that's sort of where he's getting at.
Okay, can I just, there was a comment in the chat by the libertarian Leninist Rants, who I think might have actually got it explained. See if this, what he says is that A is what you bought the stuff for, and B is what you spend to keep it running. So so it's like if it's the maintenance on the machine, so it's both the cost and the average maintenance.
All right, upkeep.
Yeah, okay, yeah, that's it. Yeah. There we go.
So does anybody have any like hand clapping sounds? We should do a cheer for a libertarian Leninist Rants. There we go. Good man. Right, so we're over that. Right. 2.1.4, productivity and value creation. I think we're over that. Does anybody else? Okay, just some terms here.
Libertarian Leninists, come on the show. Sorry, you should be on here anyway.
He should. He says that the new value is called living labor. So the value that comes from the dude or the dudette or whoever is working in the shop making the shoes, it's their labor is called the living labor, and the stuff that comes from the machinery is called. I think I'm going to call machinery machiney from now on. It sounds much better. Okay, what's next? Does anybody? I think we've done that to death. Does anybody have any problems with what we've done there?
No, that was really great. And if Andrew ever hears this, that's probably a good section to expand and to connect it to accounting more generally, because I actually thought that made that more plausible, right? If you know that there is a whole section of bourgeois practical economic activity that is like, you're saying there's like laws, you know, like that it has to be done in a certain way, and that that this is being followed here. I don't know. I found that really convincing.
Okay. I just had a quick question about Emmanuel's replacement cost stuff. So are you happy with thinking of B as replacement cost?
No. I'm very happy with a libertarian Leninist interpretation that actually makes it a whole lot more clear. It's right now. It's no doubt in my mind that's what he means.
Yeah. It's the money for the oil to keep the machine running. And
exactly, or your electricity bills or whatever, you know.
Whatever. Okay, let's go on. We got a lot of. I don't know if we're going to get through all these different bits today. Maybe we'll see how we get on. I don't think we should go on for like 8 hours, but maybe 6.5. We're on to the next part is productivity and value creation. Right, who wants to have a stab at this?
Damn it.
Okay, let me do it.
What's that?
Okay, this is a bit where I think Emmanuel was getting a bit confused. So let's mute him and then we can chat. I'm joking. I'm only joking. I've just spent the last half hour confusing everybody in the last bit. So what the hell can I say? Now, the work. Okay, so this is where we get to the concept more explicitly of the socially necessary labor time, I think. Okay, so let me just read a little bit first, and then we can discuss it. The worker's labor does not, however, add new value in proportion to its productivity, i.e., the physical output per unit of labor. An hour of average or socially necessary labor always yields the same amount of value, independently of any variations in productivity. Okay, Emmanuel, what's your problem with this line, and explain it to us? Right.
So let's just walk through the implication here, and I've done this in a table. I don't know if you guys can see it. Maybe I'll put it up later. But the idea here is that if we have let's use Kleiman's terms and his specific examples here. So he says to better understand this perhaps counterintuitive idea, assume that productivity doubles throughout an entire industry, and that for simplicity, no value is transferred from the means of production to the product. So we have a product that's 100% comprised of living labor. In this case, when the same amount of value, in this case, when productivity doubles, an hour of labor produces twice as much output, but the same amount of value. So each unit of output has only half as much value as it did before. So the idea here is if we say the entire industry produces $1,000 worth of shoes, let's say that we produce 1,000 shoes, or let's say 100 shoes, right? So the entire industry produces 100 shoes to a value of $1,000, right? During a certain period, and in period 2, we double our productivity, meaning that we produce twice as many shoes, but the amount of value at the end is going to remain constant. And what this means is that the value of shoes has to halve, right? So in other words, if you double the productivity, the value of each unit produced is going to be halved, right? Another way of stating this in mathematics is that the value of a unit is going to be 1 divided by the increase in productivity. So if the productivity triples, the amount of each unit has to decrease to 1/3 in order to offset this difference, such that the value produced in the end can remain constant. Does that make sense as his interpretation so far? Because from now on I'm going to explain why I have problems with this. So let's say that we have period 1 where we produce 100 shoes, so 100 units. The total output is 1,000. So we could draw this up as a table, and we have amount of units produced. Let's call that U. And the total output, the total value output of the industry, let's call that W, right? So in period 1, we have 100 units, 100 units, total value of 1,000. That means, that determines that the value of each unit is going to be 10, right? Period 2, next row, productivity doubles, so the amount of units double. So now we have 200 shoes. We'll look to our right-hand side, and W is already written in there for us. That's what Marx says. The socially necessary labor has to be constant. So W is still set at 1,000. This determines that the value of each shoe in period 2 is going to have. Now, what would happen in period 3 if we went back to producing 100 shoes? I.e., we have the same amount of units as we did in period 1, but with the productivity of period 2. And here's where you run into some problems. Which number are we going to carry from period 2 down to period 3? So let's see if it, damn it, I don't know if you guys could see this, but it makes a whole lot, it's made a whole lot easier if you draw this up as a table, right? So, but Kleiman is saying that between period 1 and 2, the $1,000, so the W part, the thing furthest to the right, that's going to remain constant, right? So we know it's $1,000 in period 1. That means in period 2, we need to carry that down such that that is $1,000 as well. All we need to know in that case is the amount of units. That's going to give us the per unit value, right? Here's the problem. If we have the amount of units again so that we're back to the total output of period 1, are we allowed to carry the same productivity with us? In other words, do we carry the price for the production of each shoe from period 2? So if that's the case, then we carry down the number 5. So we're still producing. It's still taking us half as long to produce a shoe because we did this productivity thing in period 2, right? However, if we do that, then W needs to halve.
Yes.
Yes.
That's exactly
right?
precise. So W goes to half, and so you're only working 500 hours of the year instead of 1,000, and you're producing the same output as in year 1.
Cool. But if that's the case, then so let's bring up Marx's quote again. If that's the case, then why is Kleiman carrying W from period 1 to period 2? And why would...
Sorry, when you say W, you're talking about a table we're going to come. You're talking about a table that we're going... Well, he does... No, so what table are you talking about here now when you say W?
I haven't done this digitally or anything.
Okay.
But maybe if you can see on the fuck it.
I think Tom has your document up here.
I have the document,
yes,
but it doesn't actually have a table for it.
I don't have it in the document. Yeah, that's the problem.
Excuse me.
So.
So explain to me what the problem is. So I'm going to put down. Explain again why. What is the problem about people just working half the amount to produce the same amount?
So if productivity doubles in period 2, right?
Yeah.
Kleiman says that the per unit value is going to halve by the 1 over productivity value, right?
Yes. Yeah.
How do we know this? Well, we know this because in period 2, the total output remains constant.
No, the total
value
labor
remains constant, right?
Yeah, the total labor remains constant, and thus the total value.
The total labor remains constant, and the total value, right? Okay.
Yes.
Right.
And in the third year, you will have reduced labor and reduced output, but productivity remain the same.
Yeah. So the productivity will carry over from period 2 into period 3. In which case, the total amount of value produced will drop by half.
Yes.
But if that's true, then the quote here doesn't really make sense to me.
Okay, read the quote there, and I'll highlight it, and we'll see whereabouts is it.
Labor does not, however, add new value in proportion to its productivity. An hour of physical output per unit of labor. An hour of average or socially necessary labor always yields the same amount of value independently of any variations in productivity.
Yes. So let's look at that. So that in the first year, the worker's labor, the value was 1,000. The physical output was 1,000. In the second year, the same amount of labor, the physical output was 2,000.
Yes.
Okay. So that's what he's saying.
Yes. And
that's
now,
all he's saying.
Yes. Okay. But
that's it.
Okay. So, but the problem being, if we return to the same amount of physical output in period 3 as we had in period 1, then the total value will have dropped by half. In which case, it's not the same amount of value.
Yeah, but they've worked less. They've worked half the amount.
Okay, cool.
That's what. Literally, that's all he's saying.
Okay, cool.
That's literally all he's saying. I'm not trying to be facetious. I'm literally saying that's exactly. You've got it exactly right.
Okay. Yeah. I was just confused by the fact that the way Kleiman explained this was that he held the total amount of value constant through period 1 and period 2, and my trouble was understanding why exactly he did that. Would that imply that in period 3 we hold the same amount of value constant there as well?
I think It's just the way he's written it. That's what he means.
Good.
You know,
Okay.
I
Yeah. Yeah.
think.
Well, cool.
It's like before, you know, I was confused with the language previously. You know, the language can be confusing sometimes. But
Right.
like, yeah, I think
mean,
that's literally all he's saying.
One way to think about
Cool.
it is that period 1 to period 2 is simulating the effect of a productivity increase without a change in value, right? While period 1, period 2 to period 3 is simulating like what happens when the value decreases and you hold productivity constant.
Right.
Right. So he's talking about he's talking about two different kinds of shocks, to use mainstream economics language that we probably want to discard.
Okay.
Makes perfect sense. All right.
Okay, let's keep going. So hopefully I'm not skipping over anything for anybody. If there's anybody in the chat who thinks we're skipping over that, let us know. So I'm just trying to get through this because we've got so much to do. Then he talks about how Marx's theory. Okay, so let's read this. This point is crucial to Marx's theory that labor-saving technological changes tend to depress the rate of profit. Although the technological changes boost productivity, they simultaneously tend to displace workers and thereby reduce the amount of new value added in production. Okay, so this is the idea that as people use more and more machines to save labor, the ratio of money spent on, or the amount of labor in each individual item is reduced, and the prices get smaller. Of this, the price reduced, but also the rate of profit will reduce. I'm being very unclear here. I'm getting tired. Does somebody else want to take over this one? Lexi, you do it.
Yeah, essentially, we're talking about a cycle of diminishing returns, and what's happening is that with less labor, right, and less value, with less labor necessary for each commodity, that same amount of value is being distributed throughout an industry. And if that keeps happening over and over, basically
prices will go.
Prices are. It's a race to the bottom. It's described as a race to the bottom. We're getting rid of the thing that makes these commodities valuable on the market. Like it's getting less and less. It's becoming more and more. I don't want to say worthless, but more and more valueless.
Cheap. More cheap. Yeah, just like me. So the idea is then as well is that like the big lump of capital that a capitalist will need to invest in machinery always is tending to get bigger. You know, a doctor used to carry around everything he needed in a bag, you know, and now you go to the doctor's surgery and there's lots of machines. And so the ratio of money that's put out in capital compared to the one that's put out in labor is growing exponentially. Not exponentially, it's growing. The tendency is always for it to grow. And if value is only created by the labor, because all the other value is just transferred, the idea of if profit comes from new labor, then we're going to see that the profit rate is going to be under pressure. And the other idea is that it's in the interest of each individual capitalist to introduce new technological change, because if they can produce their shoes cheaper, they can still sell them at the same value, at the same price. Still sell them at the same price, and even though they actually didn't actually spend as much as the other guys who were doing it less efficiently, and you can make loads of extra profit when you first introduce it. But then if the other guys start introducing it, everybody then introduced it, and then the profit rate will go down for everybody. But the capitalists can't help themselves.
Yeah.
It's just a systemic necessity that they have to do it. If they don't try and increase the productivity, they'll be put out of business. And if they do increase the productivity, they're going to lower their profit rate. You know, it's like damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Basically, what's rational for them to, seek this technological advance just creates an irrational effect in the economy.
Exactly. Yeah. Anything else in that? I think we've. How long will we go? Will we stop? Will we do one more heading, and then will we give it a rest for the day?
Well, we're almost through the Am I wrong? We're almost through the second chapter. Or is it?
Well, we have that's 2.5 we're on next, but
I'm sorry. The first half of the second chapter.
No, we have about 8 pages more to do.
Okay.
It goes up to 2.1. It goes up to number 14, and we've only gone to 5.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Oh, yeah. Right. Okay.
And we have been going nearly 3 hours between our 1 hour messing around with tech at the start and figuring out what the hell we're actually going to talk about. Why don't we just do this one more chapter and then we call it a day for today, and then we can do the rest of chapter 2 probably next week. Yeah, there's probably quite a lot in the rest of chapter 2 for even one episode.
Or even the rest of chapter 2.1.
Yeah. I hear you, Amog. I hear you. Well, who wants to talk about this? Okay, this should be fairly easy. Why don't you have a go at constant capital and variable?
Sure. So there's a distinction. So 2.1.5, right?
That's the one.
Okay. Whoop. Just let me get it open. Okay. Yeah. So there's a distinction. So now we're talking about capital investment, capitalist firms investing in production, and how we think about the sort of value dynamics of that kind of investment. And capital investment, capital value advanced, so to speak, the value aspect of capital investment divides into constant capital and variable capital, right? So constant capital is basically what we were talking about before in terms of value used to acquire means of production. And here Kleiman uses the phrase that Emmanuel was highlighting earlier on, which I think is very useful. So this is going to be the amount that the machinery and the technology costs plus the cost of maintaining it, right? This is constant capital because this is just, so to speak, the capitalist paying for the value transfer that machinery represents, right? So fixed capital, as it's sometimes called, or constant capital. And then variable capital is the capitalist advancing value in order to hire workers. And of course, the workers are, I was about to say the wild card. That's not really the word to use, but more they're the sort of
the terrorist. Terrorist is the word you're looking for.
No. I think wild card is totally accurate. It's variable capital, right?
So the reason why he called it variable is that the level of exploitation can be high or low.
Exactly. Yeah, you can mess with the amount you're exploiting workers to add new value to your product, and that's the trick. That's what makes capitalism go. But yeah. So this is the portion of variable capital is the portion of the capital that's advanced or invested or spent in order to pay wages, and of course as Kleiman says, the hiring process sets in motion capital accumulation, basically, the increase of the capital value of the firms, right? And of course, the key word surplus value, which is the difference between the capital value at the end of the process of advancement or accumulation and the capital value at the beginning of the process of accumulation. And of course, since it's only the worker who can add value, because you can increase or decrease the rate of exploitation, the amount that you're paying the worker and the amount of value the worker's adding, sorry, that wasn't a definition of exploitation. That was just me explaining the role of the worker in general. The worker's labor contributes surplus value, right? Because the machinery just transfers value. It can't increase or decrease that aggregate value. The only thing that can increase or decrease aggregate value is the value contribution of the worker, and that's where surplus value comes from, right? It's the increase in capital value from the beginning to the end of the process. Yeah. Very good.
Can I just say one thing? I think you said that constant capital is sometimes called fixed capital. That's a little error. That constant capital a fixed capital is capital that can't really move. That's like buildings and machinery and things like that. While also you have circulating capital, which can be like money or things like that, which is also a type of constant capital, as in there's no exploitation involved there. I always get that
Makes
mixed
sense.
up
Makes
myself.
sense. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah.
Just in case somebody is getting confused and they're reading Marx. Okay, so I think that's pretty good. Maybe how long is this Origin of Surplus Value chapter? We'll be able to hammer through it. Okay, we'll do this one. We'll do one more and then we'll go. How does that? Is everybody on for one more chapter before we go?
Yep.
Yeah, totally. I mean, this is it's like a page, and Amog just covered half of it.
Okay, well, why don't you have a go at this one, Lexi, then?
Okay. So the origin of surplus value. So the traditional answer for where profits come from is summed up in the phrase "buying cheap and selling dear." It's a meme in classical political economy. Marx, Marx is the great critic of this. Instead, let's see.
So he's trying to make the idea that in a case where somebody buys and somebody sells low and somebody buys low, that somebody's made a loss and somebody's made a gain, and that it's a zero-sum gain. And he's trying to get to the kind of idea that, you know, there is no value ever created in exchange, that it's always from production.
Right.
And
that's a zero-sum game. Whereas, and like what I was trying to figure out is how, like, what level of abstraction to talk about surplus labor, because the famous example that Marx uses is derived from corvée labor, which was a form of forced labor in France. And basically, he makes this comparison where, let's say, you make a bale of wheat, I don't know, you harvest like a bale of wheat a day or something, and maybe you would harvest 3 a week for yourself and 4 for the Lord. It's really obvious, that where the surplus was coming from. But then once you get into the land of capitalism and you're dealing with a work day, you might not realize that 4/7 of your work day is creating profit that's not going to you as the laborer. And so instead of selling labor, which is most classical economists and most economists think of labor markets as you're selling your labor, right? Instead of that, Marx says, no, you're not selling the value of your labor. Labor is where all this comes from. What you're selling is the ability to work. You're selling your labor power. You're selling this like kind of latent potential for value creation. Like that's what you're really selling. You're selling your ability to drive profits as a laborer. And then the capitalist reaps this as profit. This is the origin of surplus value being in value terms, profit, right? Like
that's right. Yeah, and I Marx also makes a case that it's only comes from labor. That the profits only come from labor, and this is something that will become important later on in the later chapters.
It's quite controversial, actually. Many Marxist economists don't think this anymore, but this is the big claim that even with rentier dynamics and other kinds of like stuff that you see in contemporary capitalism, that no, the realm of exchange really is this zero-sum game that deals with what the realm of production does. It distributes what the realm of production makes, and it can't make more.
Yeah, this to me, it sounds like a very real. It sounds like a very logical idea that if you think about society, what do? We build stuff, we do stuff for people. We do services and we build loads of stuff. And then that's the wealth of the economy or whatever. Not the wealth we talked about earlier, but like that's the value in the economy, and everything else about who gets it or whatever else is like a secondary kind of a thing. And this is what Marx is trying to get across: is that production is where it's at. Shareholders siphoning off money here, or a landlord charging you for your rent for no reason, only that he owns the house or something like that. Actually, everything comes from production first.
Yeah, there's even neoclassical schools of exploitation that are that just redefine exploitation as like an unfair exchange of any commodity. You know, where this isn't even saying, oh, there's an unfair exchange of labor power. It's like, no, the point of selling labor power is to generate surplus value. That's the use. That's the use value of labor power, of abstract labor power. That's what it does. That's why you buy that commodity.
Like, and it's weird, like, because my grandfather, my on my father's side, they pretty much lived in feudal times. You know, they were during the War of Independence in Ireland when they were fighting against the British. You know, the bell would ring on the guy's farm, and if you weren't down by the time, you know, 5 minutes within the bell ringing to do your labor on his land, you know, especially amongst the time when the war was going on, you were thought to be involved in the IRA and you would get shot, you know. And like my grandfather was working on that stuff, you know, you knew fine well that you just had to do some labor for this guy. Your exploitation was right there in your face, you know. The landlord got his work from you. You got a little plot of land to survive on. You know, the exploitation was right there in your face. And in capitalism, it's kind of masked.
I just want to clarify one thing for people who might be entirely new to Marxist value theory and coming at this for the first time. Like a common thing that I thought as well, like, okay, this labor power thing doesn't really make sense. What if what if I'm on hourly wages or whatever, and I only get paid whenever I work? What if we do that with a smartphone app so that my employer can watch me work and, I don't get paid when I go to the bathroom or whatnot. And one way to think about this is whenever you buy anything, so think of a car, right? If you buy a car, you're not buying miles. You're not buying miles per hour or speed. You're buying a car that has the capacity to take you miles or whatever. You're not purchasing distance or anything that the car actually does. What you're buying is a car. So that's one thing why labor power is just to help people make sense of the fact that it's always your labor power that you sell. It's really kind of it would be hard to sell labor even if it were possible. The other thing is that, just a side note, this is one of this has to be true for Marx to make sense. So if Marx has to be consistent, he's saying that the labor time socially necessary to reproduce a commodity is what determines its value. If that's true, then that has to be true of workers as well. So if you buy the labor power of an engineer for a full work year, okay, what is the socially necessary labor time required to reproduce engineers, like in general? Okay, maybe they have to pay rent, they have to pay gasoline, they have to pay for their student loans or whatever. So there's a cost attached to reproducing engineers. That's what you pay in wages. What they produce is something completely different.
Sometimes though it'll be lower, sure. It'll actually drive people into poverty, and sometimes it'll be higher. The working class is strong, and they'll actually get more than they need to reproduce. But you cannot have it below the means of reproduction for long.
Exactly.
It has to. That's like a kind of a minimal level that you need to be able to reproduce the labor force, which is, if you read Capital, you get into like in the 1800s in Britain, in the 1700s, where they actually were paying them below the rate that was needed to maintain the workforce, and the workforce was getting ill and diminished and run down and dying of all manner of different ailments.
Like Walmart, right? Okay, you pay the cashiers less than they need in order to survive, and what you get in exchange is you get food vouchers, so that they can buy back the things from Walmart with. So yeah, that's entirely true. But
One important thing to just keep hold of is that, and this is something that Emmanuel kind of touched on, is that it's very tempting to think about this as like, oh, if only we could quantify this labor power, right? If only we could somehow rationalize, what labor power is. No. It's not just that you can't do that because, oh no, things could be put to so many uses or something like that. It's that not doing that is desirable. It's important that there be a difference between what you pay for the worker and what the worker can do. So in some sense, we shouldn't think of, getting a, oh, if only we could, this, I guess, is getting into the Goethe program, money token stuff, right? Which we maybe don't want to get into. But the fact that there's a difference between labor power and wages is not a feature, it's not a bug, it's a feature. It's something that keeps the system going.
Yeah, this is the controversial heart of Marxist value theory right here. This is what threatens. This is what, this is the scientific contribution in political economy that threatens the kind of humanist claims of capitalism.
Yeah, and this is why economics shed labor theory of value, this concept of labor power. That immediately was shed because it lays bare to everybody, I think, politically, what the implications of the capitalist system, in a devastating fashion. What do people think of that?
Yeah. I think
Capitalism thing sounds really bad.
Yeah, I mean, in how many disciplines can you say that the historical left wing is trying to bring out an objective relation, and the right wing is trying to tell you it's socially constructed? Oh, it's just people feel differently, man. I mean, like what in what other discipline is this like? Is that the lay of the land? And I mean, economics and the left has deteriorated. Don't get me wrong, but like it's.
That's a very good point. That is a deep one.
I think the thing that Tom said actually about the exploitation was right there in your face. The kind of nebulousness of the selling of labor power is kind of what the current state of capitalism, which is neoliberal economics, basically is seeking to address, is that you can keep the bare minimum of what the worker needs to reproduce the labor power in the future, but everything is done as kind of a gesture of handout or a handout of charitability, and it feels. I think that's like one of the most interesting. How do I say? I think that's the thing, that the charge that it is unethical to do this is getting more serious as time goes on, because the exploitation is becoming less and less outright, and in the current state, it's it goes more and more towards the dishonest end of the spectrum to make it seem like the scraps that are given for somebody needed to reproduce their labor power is actually some kind of favor, but it really is just a way. It really is what is needed for the capitalist to maintain profit.
Yeah, and it's funny because we're talking about this now, but I remember being at Speaker's Corner in London about, I don't know, 8 or 9 years ago, before I ever read a lick of Marx. And I was arguing with a Marxist guy who I had on the podcast, Heiko Kuh. This is in my pre-Marxist days. And I was arguing the exact opposite of this point. And I was arguing like this idea of a mutually beneficial contract, where you both do well out of it. Which is, and that's like the actual, the power of that argument were so inculcated with it, like this idea of labor power to me is amazingly powerful. I just, if it can, it really breaks through that idea of this mutually beneficial contract, which is drilled into our heads from day one.
Yeah.
And the thing is, like, it is mutually beneficial. Like, you don't starve, but we don't talk about why it is you don't starve. So, like, I think Aiden's point was great in that, like, just look at how capital theorizes about itself. Like, what is it that they say? Well, they say we are the job creators, right? We create jobs, thus saving people from starvation. But what Marx sort of lays bare is the fact that, okay, how is it that you create jobs exactly? Is it true that without you there would be no machinery, there would be no windmills, churning out flour, no one would bake, no one would grow food, no one would do stuff, right? Is that the way you create jobs? Like, the only way you could create jobs is if it were true that if we didn't have capitalists, no one would build stuff. But, and when you put capitalists to the core on the spot, they'll say, well, no, of course not. I mean, if we just packed up a left, people would do this sort of thing anyway. Well, what is it exactly that you bring to the table then?
What is it, would you say, you do here?
Yeah, exactly. What exactly are you doing here? Because if that's not true, then what the hell do we need you guys for, right?
Yeah.
And it's sort of from this argument that one can deduce, which Marx also does, that the core feature of this is just private property. The core feature is they stop us from entering the windmills and the factories and things that society needs to reproduce itself on our own. What's really going on is a monopoly relation. They own the means of production, and therefore, since they own the means of production, that's the necessary condition for the rest of us to starve if we don't produce surplus value from them.
Yeah.
That's the only way we can get this sort of system, and it stems from this exact thing about labor power. It's a really powerful and elegant argument that really, keeps you awake at night.
It's really good, I think, as well, the way he has, it's called labor power, because it displays the power dynamic. Like, if I'm some like scuzzy guy and I go down and I find a prostitute on the street corner who's a drug addict, and I ask her like 10 quid to sleep with me or something, you can make the case that that's mutually beneficial to both people. She'll get money for her drugs and I'll get my rocks off, right? But it doesn't just talk about, obviously it's a scummy thing to do, but there's a power dynamic there.
Yeah.
And also the power dynamic is hidden in capitalism, and I think this concept really lays it bare. Like, if you think about what was the power dynamic, or what was your mutually beneficial contract under feudalism, it was like, if you don't do it, I'll kick your head in. That was it. I'll send a knight down there and he'll burn your house down and he'll kill your daughter or something. And you go, oh, wow, he's a job creator. The dynamic is so plain. But at the end of it is here, he just before we finish, he talks about the surplus rate, or the rate of surplus value, or the rate of exploitation. And this is where he takes the ratio of the surplus value to the variable capital. So this is the idea of like, this kind of ties into like how much you're being exploited, So like, if you're being paid half of the value that you create, so the same amount is surplus as the same amount as wages, then it's basically 100% rate exploitation. If you're being paid a quarter of it, it'll be 300% exploitation, and if you're paid 3/4 of it, it'll be 33% exploitation. That's just a simple one that we're going to meet in the future. But it's a way of calculating how much you're being screwed, essentially.
On that note, there's another argument that you hear a lot in favor of the capitalist mode of production, which is basically capitalists will argue that we are the ones who generate wealth, and from that wealth is where you make your live. That's where the pool that you draw from in order to eat and to live your life out. And you hear this argument really often, like pretty much all the time. But it is, to me, it is almost, I think it's an outright lie, in that no, the amount of labor that you have, like within that portion of your labor power that you paid for the amount to sustain, to produce the number of plumbuses that your wage allows you, and that is what is needed in order to live. Yeah, I think that pretty much goes to show right away that that really the arguments that the capitalists are the one who generate the wealth from which the rest of society thrives is, well, it's utter crap.
Yeah,
and that's not where wealth, which would, supposedly in the capitalist argument, serve to increase the quality of life, to make the quality of life better for humanity. That is the supposed pool of wealth from which that quality would come from. Well, it doesn't work.
Yeah. So they're lying about that, and they subject humanity to what was called universal prostitution. And I think this phrase and this tradition in Marxism is like very consistent with the dignity of sex workers, because honestly, sex workers have been some of the only people I heard in normie life that would articulate this. Oh, you think you're so much better than me, but you rent your body too.
Yeah. There you go.
They're damn right.
Yeah.
And okay, is there anything that we have discussed today that people have any more further thoughts or think we've missed anything before we finish up?
I don't think I've ever done anything more thoroughly and examined here. Not that I've been, particularly analytically sharp on every point, but just that I feel like I understand this way better than I did 6 years ago, and I feel like I'm doing that earlier part of myself justice by digging in like this with y'all.
Yeah, me too.
Very good. Okay, well, thanks everybody for coming on, and I'm going to just hit the stop broadcast button on, and then we can figure out when we're going to do the next one after we go out. I just want to say a shout out to everybody in the chat. Who do we have in the chat?
Yay!
We have,
Yes.
God, it's really kicking off in the chat there now.
Wow.
We've had Data Lore Delaterra.
Data Lore, what's up? Swamp Side.
A Russian name that I don't know how to pronounce it because it's in.
Do we have like a sign for Swampside? Like,
no, I just recognized. I recognize Data Lore from just I don't know, Swampside comments and stuff.
Right, but we should have like a Swampside kind of.
There's the east side, the west side.
Yeah. The only real gang, the universal gang, is Swampside.
Sure.
Yeah.
Swampside gang.
The socially necessary gang. We also have Cocter. I don't know how to pronounce your name. I really have butchered that one. Sorry about that. Who else do we have? We've got Libertarian Leninist Rants. Let's not forget about him or her.
Seriously, if they want to come on, I mean, like this is your invitation. That was a really
absolutely
great
yeah,
contribution.
Yeah. We also have Oman Damp. Let's hear for Oman Damp. And who else do we have? He's having some kind of full-on discussion on fight with somebody who's called LDSKJFHSLKJDHFSFLKHF. I think he might have wrote that name in haste.
That might be Welsh, though.
It might be Welsh. No,
Cornish.
Yeah, no, if it was Welsh, there would be a lot of Y's in there. Let's be realistic here. That's everybody. And another person called A.
So what are they saying though? What are they talking about?
Walmart, and some of them are saying hello, stuff like that.
Hey.
And A says here, I'm here to dunk on the libs. So we must have got some right wingers in here. I don't know, a right winger or a Tommy, who knows?
Oh, wow.
Is it a right winger? I mean,
horseshoe.
You could be a leftist. You could be a leftist dunking on the libs. I mean,
That's what I mean. Yeah, I'm going for your horseshoe theory again. Horseshoe all night, baby, all night.
Own those libs. Yeah.
The total Clinton supporters.
Right, everybody. Thanks very much for bearing with us. We should have a group goodbye. Will we do a group goodbye?
Yes.
Goodbye.
Goodbye, listeners.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye. Bye.
Thank you.